The Michelin-starred restaurant was a symphony of muted opulence. Emily glided across the polished marble floor like a queen surveying her domain. A waiter, starched and silent, led her to a prime table overlooking the city skyline. Suddenly, a ripple of unease shattered the refined atmosphere. Voices clashed near the bar. One man's tone was sharp and laced with an undercurrent of desperation. Another was clipped and dismissive. Emily leaned forward. This was the spice her meticulously curated evening had lacked. The commotion drew closer. David, whom she assumed was the waiter, had a back as straight as a flagpole. He was facing an older white man, the veins in his neck throbbing. David's dark eyes, usually warm and attentive, now simmered with controlled rage that set Emily's pulse fluttering. The older man was fleshy, with a face like curdled milk. He jabbed a finger at David. "You people have no respect. You think you own the place." His voice was a poisonous hiss, the kind Emily would have ignored from a distance, though up close it held a perverse thrill. "You tell them," she shouted from her table. She had dinner here every night and never liked this staff member's attitude. David's hands clenched, then unclenched. He'd been here 100 times, not just in this place, but in the world outside. "Sir, please." His tone was low but carried an unmistakable steel beneath. Words tumbled out of the older man, each one causing a fresh wound. "Lazy, think you're better than us," he spat. David placated the older man and threw apologetic glances toward the rest of the guests, his face a mask now. Emily watched as David walked out. A small victorious smirk twisted her lips as he passed. "Serves you right for not knowing your place. Next time, look in a mirror before going against someone with a face much whiter than yours," she said as he passed her table. David's final glance swept over her without rancor. Emily felt the momentary recognition in his eyes. It wasn't of her as a person, but as a type, the kind who sat and reveled in his pain and didn't care about the consequences. Emily attacked her amuse-bouche with renewed vigor. The delicate flavor was sharper and brighter after the spectacle she'd witnessed. The restaurant buzzed back into its usual symphony of hushed tones and clinking silverware. That small burst of raw humanity had added an unexpected zest to her meticulously planned evening. A different waiter materialized at her table. His black suit was impeccable, exuding a different kind of authority than David's practiced deference. "Miss Walker," he greeted. Recognition, even from a stranger, warmed her. "Yes," she purred and extended a perfectly manicured hand. Instead of the expected wine list, he placed a thick cream-colored envelope upon the spotless tablecloth. Its smooth surface gleamed under the chandelier light. Her name, Miss Emily Walker, floated across it in an elegant script more suited to a wedding invitation than a restaurant summons. Intrigue unfurled deliciously inside her. She slipped a finger beneath the heavy flap. No return address, just the weight of expensive paper and a delicate embossed crest. Her pulse quickened. She withdrew a single card. It was thick ivory stock, the kind announcing corporate mergers and political victories. In the center was a name, David. Below, in a minimalist font, were the words, "Request the pleasure of your company, Penthouse Suite, 8 p.m. A wave of confusion washed over Emily. David? Could it be? No, it couldn't. That David was a waiter. He could certainly not afford to invite a woman to a penthouse suite. Her brow furrowed. No family name on the card, and no explanation of who this man was. This was a command draped in a veil of civility. Her meticulously ordered world tilted off its axis. The waiter hovered nearby, his face discreetly blank. "Will you be attending, Miss Walker?" Emily couldn't tear her eyes from the card. Who was this David? Clearly, he thought of himself as something more than a lowly restaurant staffer. The room seemed to blur. "Attends?" The audacity of it took her breath away. But to refuse, that was a submission she wasn't readily prepared for. "Tell him I'll consider this unusual invitation," she said. The waiter nodded, knowing how this game was played. She was hooked. The invisible thread was drawing her into the unknown. As he left, Emily reached for her glass of chilled Chardonnay, but the crispness had dulled now. Her own meticulously chosen meal tasted lightly of ashes. The penthouse awaited, And even if Emily decided against this absurd rendezvous, the question remained. Who was this David, and why did the mere mention of his name have the power to unsettle her so? By 7:30 p.m., Emily found herself standing before the penthouse doors. It hadn't been a decision so much as a compulsion. Her entire life, she'd held the reins and controlled the narrative. Yet a man she didn't know had challenged her, and something primal inside her craved the challenge. A soft chime, and the door opened to reveal a world far removed from the restaurant below. Thick carpet silenced her footsteps while the scent of exotic orchids teased her nose. Enormous windows showcased the city. Original paintings with names she recognized from auction catalogs hung on vast walls. This wasn't borrowed opulence. It was a space curated with a collector's discerning eye. "Miss Walker," the voice sent a ripple through her. David, the black waiter, stood in the center of the room. His waiter's uniform had been replaced by a suit so flawlessly tailored it seemed to have been poured onto him. Gone was the tension of the restaurant. Here was an air of unhurried authority that crackled everywhere. "I'm Mr. Carver," he said. Emily's breath caught. It wasn't the lavish setting, as luxurious as it was. It was the realization twisting within her. This was his domain. Not a waiter then. Or was he just a server trying to play his hand in his master's house? She managed a cool smile, but her mind swirled with questions. What was going on here? With practiced ease, David gestured towards a plush seating area. He invited her to make herself comfortable and offered her some champagne. Emily settled into a ridiculously soft armchair. He moved to a polished bar and poured 2 generous glasses. "To unexpected meetings," David said, the barest ghost of a smile playing on his lips. Emily accepted the drink. She met his eyes, expecting triumph or perhaps a thinly veiled sneer, but there was neither. Instead, a disconcerting amusement flashed, as if he was watching a play only he understood the ending to. This unsettled her more than any overt hostility could have. "This is a spectacular home," Emily said in a bid to regain control. The vastness seemed to swallow her words. David swirled his drink, thanked her, and told her he'd worked very hard for it. There was a finality in his statement, closing the avenue of polite inquiry into his wealth. Was he truly implying that this was his house? She wondered. Silence fell, but it wasn't the comfortable kind. It thrummed with unspoken questions. The shift in power was so tangible it filled the air between them. Emily was accustomed to manipulating conversations with ease, but she found herself floundering. "Why am I here, Mr. Carver?" she asked, her voice holding a forced lightness. David sighed, then set the glass down with deliberate care. "You misunderstand, Miss Walker. You're here because you chose to be." They settled into an unspoken standoff. David chose a sleek minimalist chair facing the expansive skyline and left Emily the overstuffed armchair. David refilled their glasses. It was a silent ritual that amplified the tension. He moved with the practiced grace born of endless high-end dinners. Yet Emily couldn't shake the image of him in that ill-fitting waiter's uniform being subjected to the whims of people just like her. She'd assumed the upper hand. She believed herself the hunter. But with a terrifying shift, the prey seemed to have grown teeth. David didn't mention the restaurant. That blatant ugliness lay between them like an unspoken accusation. Instead, David spoke of his world, tech acquisitions, boardroom battles, and closing 7-figure deals with a handshake. Names she read in the Wall Street Journal flowed from his lips. None of it was a boast. It was just a recounting of everyday occurrences. With each word, Emily shrank. Her expensive cocktail dress, her pedigree, and her perfectly controlled image all seemed like flimsy props compared to the quiet power in his voice. Her world was meticulously built on social connections and inherited wealth, but it suddenly felt like a child's dollhouse that could easily be toppled. David swirled his scotch. The amber liquid caught the light. "Last month," he said, "I concluded a deal that gives me significant holdings in your company." Emily's grip on her glass tightened. Her company, the pharmaceuticals giant built by her grandfather, was her source of pride and identity. But in David's calm tone, it had been reduced to a mere asset, a piece in some financial game she couldn't grasp. "You see, Miss Walker," he said, his voice soft and devoid of malice, I own that restaurant." Emily's mouth opened in a silent gasp. It wasn't just the power and the reversal that stripped her bare. It was the realization that this wasn't an impulsive act of revenge by an aggrieved employee. This elaborate stage, this penthouse, and the fine scotch, they were pieces of a long game. She'd stepped into a carefully orchestrated trap, and she'd walked in with arrogant certainty. Shame was a bitter, coppery taste. She'd seen David as a waiter, a lesser being, one she could savor humiliating without consequence. He, in turn, had seen her as a symptom of a system he'd fought tooth and nail to conquer, and with chilling precision, he'd exposed her utter vulnerability. Her curated world crumbled. She wasn't sitting with an underling. This was a man who, with a few calculated moves, could tear down everything she valued. He didn't need to shout or hurl accusations. His power wasn't in anger. It was a chilling indifference that left her floundering. Emily finally understood. The humiliation wasn't what had happened downstairs in that crowded restaurant. It was happening now in this opulent penthouse, and she was utterly powerless to stop it. Emily Walker didn't come from a line of people who backed down. A surge of defiance pushed her to straighten her spine. This couldn't be the end. She hadn't clawed her way to the top of her social circle only to be dismantled by what exactly? A sense of misplaced justice? "This is ridiculous, childish even," she sputtered. "You lure me here under false pretenses to what? Teach me a lesson?" The old arrogance crept back. It was a familiar defense mechanism. David smiled and told her this wasn't a lesson. It was merely a consequence. She tried a different tack, a cool smile, the one reserved for difficult investors and stubborn board members. "Very well, Mr. Carver. You've made your point. I'm certain we can come to an agreement, one that's mutually beneficial." His expression didn't change. He smiled coldly again and told her money wouldn't buy her way out this time. Panic flared within Emily. Money was the universal lubricant, the tool she'd wielded since childhood, but it was useless here. Frantically, her mind grasped at another weapon in her arsenal. "Look," she leaned forward and lowered her voice into a conspiratorial whisper, a touch of flirtation, a hint of implied opportunity. In boardrooms and at charity dinners, this had melted resistance more effectively than any negotiation tactic. "I'm a reasonable woman. We can forget this unfortunate misunderstanding." David's laugh broke the spell. It was a harsh bark of sound that echoed in the opulent room. He stood towering over her. He shook his head and told her she'd misunderstood quite a bit this evening. His words stung like a slap. Humiliation burned hotter than any shame she'd ever felt. Yet it was the pity in his eyes that broke her. This wasn't about passion or vengeance. It was far colder, more clinical. He was dissecting her life and laying her flaws bare. Tears welled up, hot and unwelcome. "Please," it was a pathetic whisper even to her own ears. "I apologize for what I said and allowed to happen. It was wrong." David's expression remained unreadable. Of course, she thought bitterly, he likely wasn't used to heartfelt apologies from people like her. He moved away and stared out at the city lights twinkling below. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years and of battles fought and won. "Miss Walker, the problem wasn't the insults alone, though they hurt. It's the ease with which you believe them true, the assumptions, the unspoken judgments about who I am, where I belong." His words landed like more blows on her already pummeled psyche. As Emily saw her reflection in the window, she suddenly looked like a disheveled older woman. The mask of wealth and status was stripped away, not by David's cruelty, but by her own actions. "It isn't revenge I want," David said. "It's the dismantling of the very system that let you believe you were superior." Clarity struck Emily with the sound of a bell. David was a man who had fought his way through unseen barriers and climbed a ladder rigged against him. He was the embodiment of everything her privileged life had shielded her from. To him, she represented an entire world of casual prejudice, of entitlement masquerading as normalcy, and she'd made herself an example. She'd been blind to her own ignorance, not just in her actions towards him, but towards countless Davids throughout her life. And now she would pay a steep price. "You reap what you sow, Miss Walker," David said. "Tomorrow, this lesson becomes very public. You asked how I own that restaurant, How I ended up here, he went on. He crossed the room to a discreetly hidden panel in the wall. It slid open. Behind it was an ultramodern safe. With a flourish, David removed a thick stack of papers and returned to Emily. He slapped them on the table beside her untouched drink. Perhaps this will refresh your memory, he tilted his head. Your company, the one you so proudly sit on the board of, was the lead investor in my latest tech venture. You even saw the final authorization. Emily stared at him in horror. The papers blurred before her eyes. How? How could she have missed this or funded this? It made no sense. A cold realization washed over her. This wasn't sloppy oversight. It was deliberate. Let's just say, David said, your firm wasn't the only one who did insufficient research on my background. Or perhaps they simply failed to inform their esteemed clients. He didn't need to say more. Emily understood. Her boardroom colleagues had assumed she wouldn't sign off on funding this project if she'd known. They'd set her up for a downfall, and she fell for it spectacularly. David looked her straight in the eyes, his face expressionless. There's a press conference tomorrow morning announcing my majority ownership, and we'll be revisiting some unfortunate attitudes expressed by certain board members. You won't be attending, of course. My lawyers will see to that. Defeat crashed over Emily like a tidal wave. It wasn't just her career. It was the power she'd wielded so effortlessly. It was the entire shaky foundation her life had been built upon. Who was she without her position? What would she do without the charity balls and the carefully cultivated deference that came with her last name? David watched her crumble, and Emily knew with chilling certainty that this was the final blow. He wasn't just taking her job and her financial security. He was destroying the very essence of who she believed herself to be. David stood motionless, an unreadable silhouette against the lights. Then he said one word that made her regret everything she had done that night and many nights before: goodbye. The silence that followed was more brutal than any accusation. He was going to have her fired from her own company. With a jolt of despair, Emily realized the true cost wasn't the loss of material things. It was the loss of her place in a world that suddenly felt vast, uncaring, and utterly unfamiliar. Humiliation was just the beginning. Now she was the outsider, the one whispered about, the one looked at with the judgmental gaze she'd once wielded with such ease. For that, David understood, there was no price tag, no compensation. It was done. As Emily left the penthouse, the reality of her situation began to sink in. The elevator ride down felt interminable, each floor passing by like a countdown to her new, diminished reality. The doorman's polite nod seemed like a final mockery, a reminder of the respect she once commanded. She stepped out into the cool night air, her breath visible in the chill. The city lights, once a symbol of her dominance, now seemed indifferent, casting her in shadow as she walked to her car. The drive home was a blur. Emily's thoughts raced, each one more frantic than the last. How had she let this happen? Her mind replayed every interaction with David, each dismissive comment, each moment of condescension. It all seemed so clear now, but it was too late. Her life as she knew it was over. When she finally arrived at her luxurious penthouse, it felt different. The opulence that once brought her comfort now felt oppressive. She poured herself a drink, but the alcohol did little to calm her nerves. The grandiose furniture, the expensive art, the designer clothes, none of it mattered anymore. She was a queen without a kingdom. Emily's phone buzzed incessantly, messages from colleagues, friends, and acquaintances flooding in. The news of her downfall had spread quickly. Each message felt like a knife, cutting deeper into her already wounded pride. She knew she had to face them, to deal with the consequences of her actions, but the thought was too overwhelming. As she sank into a chair, Emily's mind wandered to her past. She remembered her upbringing, the privilege she took for granted, the lessons she learned, or rather, the lessons she never had to learn. Her family had always taught her that power and money were the ultimate goals, that those who had them were superior. But now, in her moment of despair, she realized how hollow those teachings were. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. Emily's thoughts turned to David. How had he done it? How had he orchestrated her downfall so perfectly? She recalled his words, his calm demeanor, his unwavering confidence. He had played her like a master chess player, anticipating her every move and countering with precision. She was in awe of his intelligence, his resilience, and his ability to rise above the prejudice and adversity he faced. In the early hours of the morning, as the first light of dawn crept through her windows, Emily made a decision. She couldn't change the past, but she could learn from it. She had to confront her own prejudices, to understand the system that had propped her up while oppressing others. She had to make amends, not to regain her power, but to find some semblance of redemption. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions and actions. Emily resigned from the board of her company, acknowledging her failure to lead with integrity. She reached out to organizations that supported diversity and inclusion, offering her time and resources. She attended seminars, listened to stories of those who had been marginalized, and began to understand the depth of the systemic issues she had once perpetuated. It wasn't easy. The whispers and judgments followed her everywhere. She was a pariah in her old social circles, the woman who had fallen from grace. But slowly, she found a new sense of purpose. She used her platform to advocate for change, to support those who had been silenced. She learned to listen, to empathize, and to use her privilege for good. Months passed, and Emily's life took on a new rhythm. She was no longer the powerful executive, but she was something more. She was human. She had found a way to turn her humiliation into a catalyst for growth. She knew she could never undo the harm she had caused, but she could strive to be better, to make a difference. And as she stood in front of a group of young professionals, sharing her story of downfall and redemption, she saw hope in their eyes. They were the future, and she was determined to help them build a world where no one would have to face the same prejudices and barriers that David had overcome. Emily had found her true purpose, and for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. Have you ever witnessed someone profoundly misjudge another, only to face monumental consequences? Share your stories in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, we're done here. Catch you in the next video.